The sun hadn't yet kissed the land with its full heat, but Alvara Trenhome already felt the weight of the day pulling at her. The pain in her side had started as a whisper, a mild discomfort, but now it screamed at her every time she moved. She gritted her teeth, fingers trembling as she tightened the cinch on Buttercup's saddle. There was work to be done, fences to mend, cattle to move, and she wasn't about to let a little thing like pain stop her. She'd ridden through worse. Or so she thought, but as she mounted her horse that morning, something gave way. Her knees buckled and the ground rushed up to meet her. For the first time in her life, she felt small. She reached for the reins, but her hands shook too violently. A wave of dizziness swirled over her, and she knew without a doubt that she was done for. Bitter Creek was the closest town, and she knew just where to go. But to ask for help, to let someone else take the reins, that was a step she wasn't sure she could take. The wind carried a bite this morning as Alvara Trenhome saddled up Buttercup, her trusted mare. Her left side ached with a steady throb, a pain she'd been ignoring for weeks now. She'd lived her whole life with aches and bruises, scratches from barbed wire, sore muscles from long days in the saddle. But this felt different. This was something that wouldn't be ignored. She could feel the weight of the sky above, a dull gray hinting at rain. But the landscape around her felt vast and endless as it always had. The ranch was quiet this early, just the usual sounds, cattle lowing, the wind rustling the oak trees, but today the stillness was unsettling. Her hand shook as she gripped the saddle horn, but she ignored it. One more fence to mend, one more stretch of land to walk. She swung herself into the saddle, every motion making the pain spike, but she'd been through worse. The barn was just a mile down the hill. She'd make it, she always did. But as the mare took her first step, Alvara's vision blurred. The ground swam beneath her feet. For a brief moment, everything went dark. When she blinked, the world tilted and her knees buckled. Her heart pounded in her chest, panic rising like a wild stallion. She clutched the reins, trying to steady herself, but her legs wouldn't hold her. For the first time, she felt weak. Not now, she muttered to herself, but her body didn't listen. The pain in her side twisted deeper, a knot tightening around her ribs. She bit down on her lip, willing herself to stay upright, but the world spun faster. She wasn't going to make it to the barn today. The realization hit her like a gunshot. She couldn't ride back to the ranch house, couldn't keep pretending it was just another injury. This was real. She needed help. She glanced toward Bitter Creek, the small town a couple of hours' ride away, and felt a bitter taste of shame rise in her throat. But the thought of collapsing on the ranch, alone, made her stomach churn. This wasn't just about her pride anymore. It was about surviving long enough to get back to the land she'd worked so hard to keep. Her gut twisted with hesitation, but she turned Buttercup's reins and headed toward the town. Alvara had spent her whole life avoiding the need for help. After her mother's death, she had learned early that no one was going to hold her hand through this harsh world. She had raised herself on a ranch where the only mercy was the mercy she could earn with sweat and grit. To ask for help, to let someone else take over, even for a moment, was a thought she had always shoved deep down. She was strong, tough as leather. She didn't need anyone, but now it felt different. The pain in her side, the weakness that had spread through her like wildfire, she couldn't push it down this time. As she rode toward Bitter Creek, the pain sharpened, biting at her every breath. She could feel the blood rushing to her face, her heart hammering in her chest. She was doing the right thing. She had to be. Her gaze landed on the low, wooden buildings of Bitter Creek as she approached the outskirts. The streets were quiet, the kind of small-town silence that spoke of routine and predictability. She had been here before, but never like this, never asking for help. She tied Buttercup to the hitching post outside the doctor's office, hands shaky as she dismounted. Her boots scraped against the dirt, and she forced herself to take a steadying breath. The door creaked open as she stepped inside, and the small waiting room smelled of medicinal herbs and dust. The doctor's office wasn't what she expected. She had prepared herself for the familiar sight of an older man with spectacles, maybe a whiskey flask tucked in the corner. But when she looked up, she froze. Doctor Jarth Cobburn stood in front of her, tall and confident. He didn't look like a town doctor. He didn't look like anyone Alvara expected. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his dark hair combed back neatly, his face clean-shaven. His eyes locked onto hers with an unsettling intensity. "Miss Trenhome," he greeted, his voice smooth and calm like the morning itself. "What brings you in today?" Alvara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak, to be the woman who never faltered. "I've got a pain in my side," she muttered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's nothing." Jarth's gaze softened, but there was no pity there. He moved around the desk and gestured to the examination table. "It's never nothing, Miss Trenhome. Just lay back and let me take care of you." The words came out too gentle, too kind. They cut through her like a whip. She stiffened, her chest tightening. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not in 23 years of living. Her pride rose up like a firestorm, but her body, weakened by the pain, didn't have the strength to fight back. "Don't need any of this," she muttered, her voice low, shaky. "I'm fine." Jarth raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "It's your choice, cowgirl, but pain has a way of outlasting pride." Alvara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, burning her skin. The shame was overwhelming, something she hadn't expected. She had always been the one who took care of others, who pulled herself up by her bootstraps and kept moving. To be offered care, gentle, respectful care, by a man who didn't even know her, was a blow she hadn't prepared for. She gritted her teeth and turned toward the door. But her legs refused to cooperate. They were weak from the pain, from the humiliation. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers shaking like a frightened colt, and when she finally pushed the door open, the cool breeze outside felt like a slap to the face. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. Pain has a way of outlasting pride. She wasn't sure what to do with that. The wind whipped at her hair as she hurried down the street, the clop of her boots sounding louder than ever. She just wanted to be gone, out of sight, out of mind, away from the pity she thought she'd seen in his eyes. She mounted Buttercup with a quick, awkward movement, gritting her teeth as the pain stabbed through her side again. The horse seemed to sense her mood, shifting uneasily under her, but she wasn't about to show any weakness. Not here, not in front of anyone. As she rode back toward the ranch, the town of Bitter Creek faded behind her. But the feeling of shame clung to her like a heavy coat. She could hear the whispers in her mind, the judgments of all the folks who had probably watched her storm out of the doctor's office. She imagined them standing outside, shaking their heads. "She's too proud. She won't ask for help." Her heart twisted. She didn't need their judgment. She didn't need anyone's pity. But the truth kept gnawing at her. Jarth Cobburn had been right. The pain in her side wasn't going anywhere. And if she kept pushing herself, she wouldn't last. But the thought of going back, of admitting she needed help, made her skin crawl. She rode past the old oak where she and her father used to sit after a long day, looking out over the ranch. The view hadn't changed, but somehow everything felt different. The land, the wind, even the sky, it all seemed too big, too overwhelming now. She wasn't alone anymore, but she felt as if she were. When she got home, Golden was waiting by the barn door, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as she dismounted. "You're looking like you've been dragged through a knothole backward," he observed, his voice rough but not unkind. Alvara didn't have the strength to respond with one of her usual sharp retorts. Instead, she gave him a stiff nod and headed for the barn, her boots dragging on the dirt. Golden followed her inside, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet. He watched her work for a few moments before speaking again. "What did the doctor say?" She paused, fingers gripping the saddle tightly. "Didn't see him." Golden's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "You rode all the way to Bitter Creek and didn't see the doctor? Girl, you've got less sense than God gave a goose." Alvara didn't answer, too exhausted to argue. She moved to untack Buttercup, her hands clumsy with the effort. The pain in her side had shifted, becoming a dull throb that made her breath catch every now and then. "I changed my mind," she muttered, trying to avoid looking at Golden. The old cowboy didn't let it slide. "You changed your mind, huh? And I reckon that means you're gonna just let it go, eh? I'll be fine." Her voice was quiet even to her own ears. Golden stepped closer, his expression softening with concern. "Alvara, your pa'd tan your hide if he knew you was letting pride come between you and your health." The mention of her father hit her like a blow. Her throat tightened, and she had to fight to keep the emotions in check. Benjamin Trenhome had been the toughest man she'd ever known, and he had always made it clear that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was practicality. But that didn't mean she had to listen to anyone else, did it? "It ain't pride," she muttered. But even as the words left her lips, she felt the weight of them. She had already lied to herself once today. She didn't need to do it again. Golden was quiet for a moment before speaking again, this time softer. "Then what is it, girl?" She wanted to tell him that she could handle it, that this wasn't any different from the time she'd worked through worse, but the truth was, her father wouldn't have let her go on like this. He would have dragged her back into town, forced her to ask for help even if it killed him. Alvara turned away, trying to hide the sudden lump in her throat. She didn't want to face the truth, not yet. "Forget it, Golden," she said, her voice catching. She moved toward the door, but he caught her arm, holding her still. "Alvara Trenhome, you've got so much more to give than just this pride of yours," he said, his voice low. "You're strong, but even the strongest hands need to be held sometimes." She froze, his words sinking deep into her chest. Slowly, she turned back to him. "I can't be weak. Who says you are?" Golden's eyes were steady, unwavering. "Your pride don't make you strong, Alvara. Your heart does." The next few days dragged on, stretching out like the dry Texas summer. Alvara tried to ignore the pain, but it lingered, a constant companion. It wasn't as sharp as it had been, but it was still there, reminding her with every movement, every deep breath, that she wasn't invincible. She threw herself into work, pushing through the dull ache, telling herself that it would pass. There was no time for weakness on a ranch, especially not when there were cattle to move, fences to repair, and 1,000 other chores waiting to be done. She had learned early in life that the only way to survive was to keep moving, keep working, and never let anyone see you falter. But even as she worked, the thought of Jarth Cobburn lingered in the back of her mind, like an unwelcome visitor. His words, his gentle voice, kept playing on a loop in her head. Pain has a way of outlasting pride. It wasn't just the pain that bothered her. It was the way he had looked at her, like he saw something fragile beneath the tough exterior she'd worked so hard to build. No one had ever looked at her that way. Not her father, not the men she'd worked alongside. They had all seen her as capable. As strong, never as someone who might need care, someone who might need help. She didn't know what to make of it. The days bled into each other, and by the time the weekend rolled around, Alvara found herself once again riding toward Bitter Creek, though this time with a purpose. She needed supplies, coffee, flour, some ammunition for the rifle, and maybe a few more excuses to avoid seeing the town doctor. She tied Buttercup outside Sewell's general store and went inside. Her steps hesitant but determined. She didn't want to go back to Jarth Cobburn's office. She didn't want to have that conversation, the one that would force her to confront the truth about her pride and her body and all the things she had been running from. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she loaded her arms with supplies, a familiar voice cut through the bustle of the store. "Afternoon, Miss Trenhome." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. There he stood, standing just outside the post office, his dark eyes fixed on her with that quiet intensity that made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't used to. Jarth Cobburn. She froze, the sack of flour nearly slipping from her grip as her breath caught. Her first instinct was to duck behind the nearest barrel or horse, but that would only make things worse. So she forced herself to stand tall, to be the cowgirl everyone expected her to be. She stepped around the counter, trying to act like everything was fine. She was fine. "Doctor," she managed to say, her voice rougher than she intended. "Feeling better, I hope." His words were kind, almost too kind, and they sent an uncomfortable flutter through her chest. "Fine as frog's hair," she muttered, brushing past him with more force than she needed. She wasn't about to let him see how much he had rattled her. Jarth glanced at the sack of flour in her hands and the other supplies, his gaze measuring. "Stocking up for the winter, I see." "Just the usual," Alvara said, lifting the sack of flour to emphasize the point, though the effort was strained. Her side throbbed with each movement. She didn't want him to see, didn't want him to know. But Jarth's eyes didn't miss a thing. His gaze flickered to her left side and then back to her face. She could see the concern in his eyes, the way he didn't believe her when she said she was fine. He knew, just like he had known before. He didn't push, though. Instead, he gave her a small, understanding smile and touched the brim of his hat. Well, don't let me keep you, Miss Trenhome. But remember, my door is always open. If you change your mind about that examination. His voice trailed off, leaving the offer hanging in the air like a threat she couldn't escape. She couldn't decide whether she was angry or relieved. I won't need it, she replied, her voice colder than she intended. She turned away from him and walked out of the store, her heart thudding so loudly she thought it might give her away. The ride back to the ranch was slower this time. Her body ached, not just from the physical strain of the day's work, but from something deeper, something she didn't have a name for. Jarth Cobburn had done something to her that she wasn't ready for. He had gotten under her skin in a way no man ever had before, and that terrified her more than anything. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. Golden was waiting for her at the barn door, as always, his eyes sharp as he saw her approach. "Well," he asked, his voice gruff but warm. "What happened?" Alvara didn't answer at first. She unsaddled Buttercup with a mechanical precision, her movements stiff as she worked. The pain had become a steady companion now, a reminder that she couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. "I saw him again," she said finally, her voice low. "Out in town." Golden didn't ask who, he knew. "What did he say?" Alvara paused, her fingers tracing the edge of Buttercup's saddle. "He told me to come back to his office, to let him take care of me." Golden raised an eyebrow. "You didn't go?" "No." Alvara's voice was firm, but there was an edge of uncertainty she couldn't shake. "I won't go." "You're stubborn as hell," Golden muttered, shaking his head. "I'm fine." Alvara replied, though the words felt hollow. She knew deep down that she wasn't, but she wasn't ready to admit it. Not to Golden, not to herself, and definitely not to Jarth Cobburn. Golden's eyes softened, but he didn't push her. Instead, he turned and headed toward the barn, leaving Alvara to stand in the fading light of the evening, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. The days seemed to blur together, the work never stopping, never giving her a chance to rest. Alvara woke before dawn each day, the pain in her side a constant reminder that she wasn't as invincible as she liked to believe. It wasn't the kind of pain that kept her in bed, but it was enough to make her question whether pushing through it was really the smartest choice. But she didn't let herself dwell on it. The ranch needed her. The cattle needed her. She couldn't afford to be weak. Still, there were moments when the thought of Jarth Cobburn crept into her mind, uninvited. Each time she shoved it away, focusing instead on the work that lay ahead. She wasn't about to let a doctor, or anyone else, distract her from what she knew she had to do. That was until the morning of the cattle sale. Brelin Marquette had sent word that her late husband's herd was up for sale, a deal too good to pass up. Alvara had been saving for this, watching for the right opportunity to expand her own herd, to build something lasting on the land her father had left her. This was it. She'd spent the night before preparing, tending to the horses, making sure her saddle was in good condition, checking her gear. She'd even tried to wash the dirt from her face and braid her hair into some semblance of order, though she knew there was no getting rid of the ranch's dust from her clothes. But today, she wasn't just Alvara Trenhome, the cowgirl. Today, she was a businesswoman and she needed to look the part. She left the ranch house early, not bothering to eat, her stomach a tight knot of nerves and anticipation. As she rode into Bitter Creek, the familiar sights and sounds of the town didn't offer her any comfort. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for the cattle sale to start. When she tied Buttercup to the hitching post outside Brelin's boarding house, Alvara's heart skipped a beat. She could already see the other buyers gathering inside, men she knew, men who had the kind of money she couldn't hope to compete with. But she couldn't let that deter her. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. Inside, the parlor was warm, the smell of coffee and apple cake hanging in the air. Brelin greeted her with a knowing smile and led her to a seat by the window, where they could watch the others gather. The conversation turned to business quickly enough. Brelin offered her a cup of coffee, which Alvara accepted, though she couldn't really taste it. Her mind was too focused on the herd and the deal she was about to make. As they discussed terms, Alvara tried to ignore the buzzing thoughts in the back of her mind. She wasn't about to let anything, least of all a man, distract her from what needed to be done. But then, as Brelin spoke of the other offers, a familiar voice cut through the air. You're looking at the cattle. Jarth Cobburn's voice was smooth, casual, but there was an unmistakable edge to it that made Alvara's pulse quicken. She turned to face him, her stomach twisting in a knot she couldn't untangle. He stood at the doorway, looking every bit the part of a man who belonged in this world of business and money, his expensive boots polished to perfection and his coat hanging just right. He didn't belong here, not in this world, but somehow it didn't matter. He had a presence, one that made everything else seem small in comparison. Alvara's breath hitched before she could stop herself. She didn't want him here. She didn't want him complicating things, but it was too late. He'd seen her. He'd already walked into her space, and now he was here, watching her as if he could see right through the walls she had built around herself. Brelin smiled, a knowing look in her eyes as she stood up to greet him. "Dr. Cobburn," she said with a little too much sweetness. "I didn't know you were interested in cattle." "I'm always interested in good stock," he said with a half smile, his eyes flickering to Alvara before returning to Brelin. "And it looks like there's a fine herd up for sale today." The way he said it, the casual air about him, made Alvara bristle. "Just the usual," she replied quickly, turning back to the window, pretending not to care. But she couldn't stop the way her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was frustration, confusion, or something else entirely. They continued their negotiations, but Alvara couldn't shake the feeling that Jarth was still watching her. His presence hovered over her like a storm on the horizon, and she couldn't make it go away. Finally, the bidding began, and Alvara forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She kept her eyes on the cattle, the price, the terms, and made sure her bid was solid. But every time she glanced around, her gaze seemed to find Jarth's. He was there standing at the back, watching her with an unreadable expression. The auction dragged on, the other buyers throwing their bids in, but Alvara stayed focused. She knew she couldn't afford to lose this herd, not when the future of her ranch depended on it. She couldn't let anything, least of all Jarth Cobburn, get in her way. Finally, the bidding came to an end. Brelin looked at Alvara, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You got it," she said, her voice almost teasing. "Looks like the Trenhome ranch is about to get a little bigger." Alvara's heart leaped with relief, and she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders, but before she could respond, she heard Jarth's voice behind her again. "Congratulations, Miss Trenhome," he said smoothly, stepping closer. "It's a fine herd. You've got a good eye." Alvara turned to him, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you, Dr. Cobburn." He smiled back, his gaze lingering on her a little longer than necessary. "I imagine that's a lot of work, though. A ranch of that size requires a lot of care." "I'm used to hard work," Alvara replied sharply, not wanting to show any weakness. She turned back toward Brelin, her chest tight. Jarth's words, though polite, made her feel exposed. She didn't need him reminding her of what she was up against. She didn't need him to see her as a woman who had to fight for everything, a woman who was trying to do it all on her own. "Of course," Jarth continued, his tone casual, but there was an undertone of something else. "Though, if you ever find yourself needing help, my doors are always open." Alvara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "I'll keep that in mind." And with that, Jarth turned and left the room, his presence fading as quickly as it had come. Alvara stood there, her heart racing, and tried to shake off the feeling of being caught in his gaze, of being vulnerable under his watchful eyes. She had won the cattle. She had done it. But something still lingered in the air, something she couldn't quite shake. The deal was done, but she was still far from finished. The next few days passed in a blur of work and exhaustion. Alvara hardly noticed the hours slipping by as she threw herself into tending to the new cattle. The herd was settling in well, though she knew it would take time to adjust to the land and the weather. There was always something to fix, fences to mend, troughs to fill, the occasional rogue steer to wrangle back into the fold. But it wasn't just the cattle keeping her busy. The pain in her side hadn't gone away, though it was manageable for the most part. It had become a dull throb, something she could live with as long as she didn't overexert herself. Still, it wasn't the physical pain that plagued her. It was the knot of unease that had settled in her chest since the cattle auction. Jarth Cobburn hadn't let her off easy. Not that he had to. He knew exactly how to make her feel like she was caught between two worlds, the one she'd built on grit and hard work, and the one he represented with all its polished ease and certainty. Every time she thought about him, about how he had looked at her, about his words, she felt her stomach twist. She hadn't wanted to think about him, but it seemed impossible not to. It wasn't just his kindness or his persistence in offering help. It was the way he had seen through her, the way he had offered care without expecting anything in return. She didn't know how to handle that. She didn't know how to handle him. Alvara spent the days as she always did, riding out in the early morning, managing the ranch, keeping to herself. But the evenings were different. Her thoughts kept drifting back to that brief moment at the auction when Jarth had congratulated her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his words, that they weren't just polite pleasantries. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon on the fourth day after the auction, Alvara was worn thin. Her body was tired from the constant movement, but her mind was even more exhausted from the inner battle she was waging. She had nearly forgotten about the pain in her side until the evening had crept up on her. Golden had gone into town for supplies, leaving her alone at the ranch. The silence was heavy, thick with the memories of her father's teachings, his steady presence that had always been a rock. She could almost hear him now, telling her that pride wasn't something to hide behind, that true strength wasn't just about enduring, it was about knowing when to ask for help. But Alvara had never been good at asking for help. She'd never had the luxury. She stood on the porch, staring out across the land, her hand resting on the rough wood of the railing. The wind had picked up, swirling the dust across the ground and making the trees sway gently in the fading light. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever. She couldn't keep pretending that the pain was something she could ignore, or that the feelings she was trying to bury about Jarth Cobburn would go away. As she turned to head inside, her gaze caught the familiar sight of a rider approaching, dust rising behind him like a cloud. Her heart sank. Jarth Cobburn. He rode in on a chestnut gelding, the same one he'd been on when he had come by last time. He wasn't in his doctor's coat, but he still looked every bit the part of someone who belonged in a world of money and privilege. His movements were fluid, confident, as though he had all the time in the world to be here. For a moment, Alvara didn't know what to do. She stood still, frozen in place, her breath catching in her chest. He was coming closer, and she knew that she couldn't keep avoiding him. She couldn't keep pretending that their last interaction hadn't left an imprint on her. The horse slowed as he neared, and Jarth raised a hand in greeting. "Good evening, Miss Trenhome," he called, his voice carrying easily in the stillness of the evening. Alvara forced herself to breathe. "Doctor." She replied stiffly, keeping her back straight and her gaze steady. "What brings you out here?" Jarth dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "Thought I might check on the cattle, see how they're settling in." He glanced toward the corral where the new herd had begun to graze. "Looks like they're doing well." "They are," she said, but she couldn't help the tension in her voice. She wasn't sure what he was doing here or if she wanted to know. She hadn't expected him to follow up so soon after the auction. He stepped closer, and for the first time since their encounter at the general store, Alvara realized just how close he was. She could smell the faint scent of leather and soap on him, mixed with the earthy tang of horse. It made her heart beat faster, and she didn't know why. "Miss Trenhome, I hope you don't mind my visit," Jarth said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. There was something different in the way he was looking at her now, something deeper. "I'm not here to interfere, but I wanted to make sure you're all right. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day." Alvara's breath caught in her throat. She had thought about it more times than she cared to admit. "I'm fine," she said, though it felt like a lie. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to stand tall in front of him. He didn't buy it. "Alvara." He said her name like a quiet plea, like he was trying to reach through her walls. "You don't have to do this alone." She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him she didn't need anyone, but the words got caught in her throat. She had spent her whole life telling herself she didn't need help, that she could do it all on her own. But now, standing here in front of Jarth Cobburn, she wasn't so sure. "I can't," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I've spent my whole life doing this. I don't know any other way." Jarth's expression softened, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He stepped closer, reaching out to gently take her hand. "Then let me help you, Alvara. Let me be the one to take care of you for once." Her chest tightened, a rush of emotion sweeping over her. For so long she had kept everyone at arm's length, unwilling to let anyone in. But here, with him, everything felt different. The quiet tenderness in his touch was enough to make her hesitate, to make her question everything she had believed about herself. "I can't just let go," she said almost to herself, her voice trembling. "You don't have to let go all at once," he said gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "But you can let me in, just a little, let me help you heal." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a man trying to break through her walls. She saw someone who cared, someone who truly wanted to be there. The realization settled over her like a quiet storm. Alvara nodded slowly, her throat tight with unspoken words. She didn't know how this would play out. She didn't know what the future held. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from the things that scared her the most. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty and quiet reflection. Alvara's heart was still unsettled, but there was something else that had begun to settle in her chest, something that felt like peace, like the first clear breath after a storm. She hadn't let Jarth in completely, not yet, but she had let him close enough to hear the whispers of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. She didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know if she was ready to change the way she lived her life, to stop carrying everything on her shoulders, to let someone else take some of the weight. But every time she saw him, every time she heard his voice or felt his touch, it became harder to deny the pull between them. It was more than attraction. It was something deeper, something that reached into the parts of her she had long buried. The pain in her side had eased, but the emotional weight she had carried for so long remained. She knew she couldn't keep pretending to be strong in every way. She couldn't keep shutting people out just to prove she could handle it all. On the third morning after their conversation, Alvara was tending to the cattle when she saw a familiar figure riding toward the ranch. It was Jarth, once again, but this time it was different. His posture was less formal and his expression more relaxed. He wasn't wearing his doctor's coat or looking the part of the polite stranger anymore. This time, he was just a man who had come to check on her, to offer help, but also to be there in a way she wasn't used to. She froze for a moment, her hand resting on the fence post. The old, familiar instinct to pull away kicked in, but it was quieter this time, drowned out by the voice in her head reminding her that things didn't have to be the same. Things could change. She made her way to Buttercup, who was grazing nearby, and gently patted her neck. Her mare had been her constant companion through thick and thin, but today it wasn't just the horse she was counting on. She tied Buttercup to the hitching post and straightened up, wiping the sweat from her brow. Jarth was almost at the corral now, his horse moving at a steady pace. As he dismounted, he caught her gaze and gave her a small, knowing smile. "Morning, Miss Trenhome," he greeted, tipping his hat. "I thought I'd ride out and check on the herd. How's everything going?" Alvara's heart fluttered in her chest and she had to force herself to focus. "It's going well enough," she replied, though there was something in her tone that wasn't quite as guarded as usual. She wasn't hiding anymore, not from him. Jarth stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirt beneath them. "Good, glad to hear it." His eyes were warm, but there was something different in the way he looked at her now, something deeper, more sincere. "You've been working hard." She nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of his gaze. "The ranch needs it, can't let it fall apart." "No, you can't," he agreed quietly. He took a step closer, his presence surrounding her like the cool breeze from the north, steady and reassuring. "But you don't have to do it alone." She felt the sting of his words, the truth in them, and it cut through the walls she had built. It made her uncomfortable, not because she didn't want help, but because she wasn't used to it, not from someone like him. "I'm not used to asking for help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jarth's expression softened. "I know, and you don't have to ask. Just let me be here when you need it." She looked away for a moment, her thoughts tangled. Part of her wanted to argue, wanted to push him away. She had spent so many years learning how to carry everything herself, how to live without relying on anyone. It was easier that way. It was safer. But when she looked at him again, something in her shifted. It wasn't just his concern that made her feel this way. It was the steadiness of his presence, the way he made her feel like she wasn't alone, even when she was. And maybe, just maybe, that was the thing she had needed all along. "You don't have to keep checking on me, Jarth," she said, her voice soft but clear. I can take care of myself." He didn't step back, didn't take his eyes off her. "I don't think you want to," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "I don't think you want to keep running on empty." Alvara swallowed, her throat tight. She didn't know what to say to that, but Jarth didn't expect her to respond. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bottle, the same one he had offered her a few days ago. "For the pain," he said, handing it to her. "I'll leave it with you, but you know where to find me if you need more." Her fingers brushed against his, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. The contact was brief, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. She looked down at the bottle in her hand, then back up at him. "Thank you." Jarth nodded, his smile soft and understanding. "Of course, Alvara, take care of yourself." And with that, he mounted his horse once more and rode off, leaving her standing there, the bottle in her hand, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Alvara stood there for a long time, watching him disappear down the road. The pain in her side was still there, but it seemed quieter now, as if Jarth's presence had somehow softened it, made it less menacing. She didn't know what it all meant, but she knew that it wasn't just the pain she was dealing with anymore. It was the pull she felt toward Jarth, and for the first time in her life, she didn't mind the feeling.